in the heart of Montana, in a place where the wind whispers through endless fields. Something impossible was buried. It began with a group of ranchers. A routine day's work until their shovels struck something that wasn't stone, wasn't wood, but bone. 14 skeletons, each with skulls longer, stranger than anything human anatomy should allow. Within days, the site was sealed. The bones vanished, and the people who found them never spoke again. Were they ancient giants, survivors of a lost civilization, or proof of something not of this earth? Tonight, we're going to dig up a secret buried for over a century. Like and subscribe to our channel, Dust Files, for more forgotten mysteries, and comment down your favorite topics. The winds of Montana carry secrets. They move across endless plains and jagged hills, whistling through the bones of a land older than memory. Out here, the soil has swallowed entire lifetimes, the hoofprints of buffalo herds, the trails of vanished tribes, the forgotten remains of those who came long before the first maps. But in the late 1800s, something rose from the earth that was never meant to be found. It began, as many discoveries do, without ceremony. A group of ranchers, hardened by frontier life, were tending to their cattle on the outskirts of a small, unremarkable settlement. The day was dry, the ground brittle from weeks without rain. A routine task, digging a new fence post, became anything but routine when a spade struck something solid. At first, they thought it was stone, but stone doesn't give under metal. Stone doesn't make a hollow sound. Curiosity overrode caution. They dug wider, deeper. What emerged was a curve of bone, pale against the dark soil. It was a skull, but not like any skull they had ever seen. The cranium was long, unnaturally long, stretching back in a slope that defied the proportions of normal human anatomy. And this was just the beginning. The men uncovered more bones, more skulls. One after another, the bodies took shape in the dirt, aligned in a deliberate arrangement as if part of some ancient ceremonial burial. 14 skeletons in total, all with the same strange feature. Elongated skulls, each more than twice the size of an average human's. For a moment, the ranchers stood in silence, staring at the strange remains. In an era when the American West was still half wild and full of superstition, such a sight would have been more than unsettling. It was dangerous. This was not something to talk about lightly. They could have gone to the local sheriff. They could have written to the nearest university or the Smithsonian. But in those days, the Smithsonian was already whispered to have an interest in anomalous finds, an interest that often ended with those finds vanishing from public record. And these men, practical to their core, understood something unspoken. Whatever this was, it might not be safe to share. News of the discovery didn't spread like wildfire. It trickled in half-whispered conversations at the saloon, in letters written but never sent. A few local papers made brief, vague references to unusual remains uncovered on the plains, but the language was cautious, almost deliberately dull. Yet the land had its own memory. Long before settlers claimed Montana, the indigenous tribes told stories of a people unlike any other. They spoke of long-headed ones who came from far away, and of great battles fought between these strangers and the ancestors of the tribes. In some accounts, the long-headed ones were giants, towering above ordinary men. In others, they descended from the sky, bringing knowledge and strange tools, only to vanish after a great conflict. The skulls in the ground matched the old stories too closely to ignore. Even the way they were buried, in a formation that suggested ritual, not accident, hinted at a culture with purpose, hierarchy, and perhaps even reverence for death. These were not random casualties. They were something else entirely. Still, time has a way of swallowing inconvenient truths. Within weeks, the site was quiet again. The bones were removed, though no one could later say exactly by whom. The ranchers went back to their lives. The few locals who had heard about it found the topic harder and harder to discuss, as if some invisible hand had pressed down on the town, smothering curiosity. But rumors lingered. They always do. Some claimed the skeletons were taken east, created and shipped under the authority of a nameless government agency. Others swore that night riders, men dressed in black, their faces hidden, came and loaded the remains into covered wagons before disappearing into the darkness. In the decades that followed, the story faded into the background noise of frontier legends. But the detail of those elongated skulls never went away. It clung to the tale like a burr to cloth. Skeptics argued the skulls could be the result of cranial binding, a practice in some ancient cultures where the head was intentionally reshaped from infancy. But that explanation faltered when they considered the size of the skulls themselves. Not just longer, larger. The brain cavity was far bigger than that of a normal human. And that detail, if true, changes everything. Were these beings human at all? If they were not the kind of human we know. And if they weren't, then who or what lay beneath the Montana soil? For the people who lived nearest to the site, it wasn't just an archaeological question. It was a warning. The old tribal accounts described the long-headed ones as powerful, cunning, and in some tellings, dangerous. They weren't wiped out by disease or famine. They were defeated. The burial site wasn't just a graveyard. It might have been a battlefield. And so, the mystery remained, lodged in the cracks between history and legend. 14 elongated skulls, found by chance on a ranch in Montana, quietly erased from public record. No photographs, no museum displays, no official acknowledgement they ever existed. Only the whispers of a discovery too strange, too disruptive, to be allowed into the story we tell ourselves about the past. But the land hasn't been forgotten, and neither should we. Montana's history, as most people know it, begins with the frontier. Cowboys driving cattle across open range, gold prospectors panning in icy rivers, small towns rising from the dust, only to vanish when the mines went dry. But the truth is, those stories are little more than a flicker, the final frames in a film that has been rolling for tens of thousands of years. The real Montana is far older, and far stranger. Long before the first wagon creaked its way into these valleys, glaciers towered over the land. Massive ice sheets, hundreds of feet thick, crawled slowly across the plains, carving canyons and spilling boulders like breadcrumbs in their wake. When they melted, they left behind a raw, scarred world, perfect for hiding secrets. Archaeologists tell us the first human presence here dates back roughly 12,000 years, during the late Ice Age. They speak of the Clovis culture, the so-called first Americans, hunters who tracked mammoths and giant bison with finely crafted stone points. But the deeper researchers dig, the more that timeline begins to blur. Scattered across Montana are sites that don't fit neatly into the textbook narrative. Charcoal layers buried in ancient riverbeds that carbon date to 20,000 years ago, far older than Clovis. Stone tools found in sediment untouched since before the glaciers came. Each discovery forces a quiet recalculation, as if the land is whispering, "You don't really know me at all." And then, there are the anomalies no one seems eager to explain. In remote canyon walls, petroglyphs etched by hands long vanished depict thin figures with elongated heads, unmistakable in their shape, even after centuries of weathering. Some archaeologists dismiss them as artistic exaggerations, but others see something more. A record, perhaps, of a people who were here long before the ancestors of the tribes we know today. There are also the stones. Not just any stones, megalithic blocks buried under centuries of soil and grass, some forming strange circular patterns. They are heavier and larger than anything the early native cultures of this region are believed to have moved. And yet, here they are, resting in silent alignment with no clear origin story. A few points, with eerie precision, to celestial events. The solstices, the rising of specific stars, a hallmark of ancient civilizations obsessed with the heavens. If these structures are as old as some geologists suspect, they would predate known native architecture by thousands of years. Which leaves a question that lingers in the mind like smoke. Who built them and why? In the 1970s, a small team of researchers conducted limited digs at one such site in central Montana. Their notes mention an unusual find, fragments of bone that, when tested, gave carbon dates so inconsistent that the team concluded the samples were contaminated. The report was never followed up, and the bones were quietly placed in storage. Some say they were later removed entirely, their location now unknown. These scattered threads, the misaligned dates, the impossible structures, the strange depictions of long-headed beings might seem unrelated, but woven together, they form a picture of a land that has been host to more than one chapter of human, or perhaps non-human habitation. The indigenous oral histories add another layer to this puzzle. Many tribes in the region speak of ancient conflicts with a people not of our kind. The Salish tell of Viscanox, described as taller and stronger than ordinary men, with heads that seem to stretch toward the sky. The Crow recounts tales of a race of star people who arrived in a time before the Great Flood, teaching skills and crafting tools that no longer exist today. In nearly every version, the long-headed ones disappear, not through natural decline, but through conflict and destruction. Mainstream history tends to sidestep these legends, treating them as purely symbolic or mythological. Yet, when physical evidence surfaces that mirrors these accounts, like the 14 elongated skulls uncovered in Montana, the fit is almost too precise to ignore. It's tempting to think of history as a straight line, a simple march from past to present. But here, in Montana, the layers twist and overlap. Civilizations rise, leave their marks, and vanish, only to be overwritten by the next. In this sense, the elongated skulls aren't just a curiosity. They're a reminder that our timeline is fragile, built on assumptions that crumble when the Earth decides to show us something it's been keeping. And the Earth here has kept much. Beneath the grazing fields, under the shadow of the mountains, there may be entire settlements still buried. Settlements that could rewrite our understanding of who lived here, when they lived here, and how far their reach extended. Which brings us back to that burial site from the late 19th century, the one the ranchers stumbled upon by accident. If the skulls truly belong to a civilization predating known history, then their presence here isn't random. It's part of a far older story, one that stretches back into the deep past, beyond even the first known humans in North America. Yet that story has been systematically blurred, its chapters torn out. And if you follow the paper trail, or the absence of one, it leads to a pattern seen again and again across the continent. Anomalous finds quietly disappear. Records are altered or destroyed. Official explanations are issued, even when they contradict the physical evidence. It's here, standing between what the land tells us and what the record books say, that the mystery sharpens. Because if these elongated skulls don't fit into the accepted history of Montana, the only question left is whose history do they belong to? Long before the 14 elongated skulls surfaced in Montana, the Great Plains already had a legend, one whispered by generations of native storytellers, carried across the windswept grasslands like an echo from another age. These were not tales of ordinary men. They spoke of giant warriors, towering 7, sometimes 10 feet tall, their skulls long and sloping, their presence both feared and revered. The Crow called them the Awakul, a race of immense stature said to have roamed the high plains long before the Crow themselves arrived. In their telling, these beings were not simply tall. They possessed a strength that could uproot trees, the endurance to run down game without rest, and eyes that glinted with an otherworldly light under the setting sun. And yet, despite their power, their story always ends the same way. They vanished. The Blackfeet speak of a similar people, warriors with elongated heads who wielded weapons too heavy for ordinary men. Some accounts describe them as protectors of the land, others as conquerors who ruled with iron authority until their numbers dwindled after a great war. Elders tell of ancient battlegrounds where the soil still yields strange arrowheads, larger than any crafted in recent centuries, as if made for hands far larger than our own. Even the Sioux hold echoes of this presence. In their oral tradition, the Shitanka, or big men, were a race of red-haired giants who arrived from the west in a time beyond memory. The Sioux say they were fierce opponents, often hostile, yet capable of forging uneasy truces with the tribes when facing shared threats. Their size and unusual skull shapes set them apart, but their most striking detail was always the same. Their heads seemed to stretch upward, as though reaching for the sky. It's easy for the modern mind to dismiss such accounts as metaphor, symbols of bravery, strength, or supernatural power. But these stories are not isolated. They repeat across hundreds of miles and multiple tribes, each with their own name for these beings, each passing down their version of the encounters. And when you step outside the plains, the pattern doesn't stop. In Peru, the Paracas culture left behind skulls so elongated that modern researchers still debate whether they were purely the result of head binding or something more intrinsic to their biology. In the Middle East, Sumerian and Egyptian art depicts deities and royal figures with unnaturally long craniums, often linked to divine wisdom or authority. Across the Pacific, in Micronesia and Easter Island, oral histories mention tall, long-headed rulers who arrived from distant lands and established civilizations before mysteriously vanishing. This is where the Montana discovery begins to feel less like an anomaly and more like a missing puzzle piece in a much larger picture. Anthropologists who have studied these legends often argue that giants were simply symbolic, exaggerations to emphasize an enemy's strength or importance. But that explanation struggles to account for the specificity of the details. Why do the skulls in these stories so often share the same unusual shape? Why do so many legends, oceans apart, link these beings to advanced knowledge, celestial alignments, or origins from beyond the known world? Some researchers outside the academic mainstream have drawn a bolder conclusion, that these legends are not myth at all, but fragments of an old record, describing encounters with a distinct race or species, one that may have walked alongside early humans before being driven to extinction. They argue that the oral traditions of the Crow, Blackfeet, Sioux, and others are less about symbolic storytelling and more about preserving a truth so ancient it has outlived its physical evidence. Except, perhaps, for the occasional discovery like the Montana skulls. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, newspapers across the Midwest and Plains occasionally published brief, sensational reports of giant skeletons unearthed by farmers or construction crews. Many of these accounts, now buried in old archives, describe skeletons measuring 8 feet or more, often with unusually large skulls. Few of these remains made it into museums, and fewer still remain accessible today. Most were quietly removed, destroyed, or stored away in private collections. Whether those early reports were true, exaggerated, or entirely fabricated, their uncanny resemblance to the ancient tribal legends is hard to ignore. And if even a fraction of them were real, it suggests that the Montana discovery may not have been an isolated find, but rather one of the few cases that ever made it to the light of day before being pulled back into the shadows. The power of oral tradition lies in its endurance. It carries knowledge across centuries without the need for writing, surviving in the spoken word where stone tablets or parchment might have crumbled to dust. But it also requires trust. Trust that the storyteller is passing on truth and that the listener will keep the thread alive. In the case of the Great Plains giants, that thread stretches so far back that its origins blur, tangled in the mists of time. And yet, when you hold that thread up to the Montana skulls, the match is haunting. the shape, the scale. The idea of a people who were here before history began. A people remembered only in fragments, in warnings, in the kind of stories told around fires. Stories that carry just enough truth to unsettle anyone who listens closely. The Plains tribes didn't write their history in books. They carved it into memory. And perhaps they did so because they knew, as the Montana skulls may prove, that some truths are too strange, too dangerous to be recorded where anyone might find them. When the Montana skulls were first unearthed, the discovery barely made it into the public record. A small-town newspaper ran a single column describing unusual burials found on a remote patch of land. 14 skeletons, each with elongated craniums and unusual proportions. The article was brief, almost cautious, as if the editor wasn't entirely sure the story should be printed at all. Then, silence. No follow-ups, no photographs, no official archaeological reports. For the people who lived nearby, the memory lingered. A rancher's grandson recalled his grandfather coming home shaken, muttering that he'd seen heads shaped like eggs. Another man, whose father was part of the dig crew, later claimed that within 48 hours of the find, government men arrived in unmarked trucks. They spoke little, took detailed measurements, and loaded the remains into heavy crates. By the end of the week, the site was filled in, fenced off, and officially declared inconclusive. It's a story that echoes across American history. In the late 1800s, reports of giant skeletons unearthed in states like Ohio, Wisconsin, and Nevada briefly captured headlines, only to vanish just as quickly. Some accounts even claim that the Smithsonian institution took possession of these remains before quietly denying their existence. Critics call these stories exaggerated or outright hoaxes, but the pattern is unsettling. Extraordinary discoveries followed by abrupt disappearances, with just enough paper trail to suggest something real was found. The Montana case fits this pattern too well to ignore. Old microfilm archives show that the initial newspaper mention came from a local reporter with no prior history of sensationalism. His language was restrained, factual, almost clinical, which makes the sudden absence of follow-up even stranger. In an era when local papers would run multi-part features on far less sensational finds, why did this story die in a single breath? Some locals whisper about quiet intimidation. That rancher's grandson said his family was told not to repeat wild stories if they wanted to avoid trouble. The man whose father worked the dig claimed his father's tools, and even his work journal vanished from their shed a week after the site was sealed. And yet, none of these witnesses could produce proof. It's as though the physical evidence was erased, leaving only the memory of its existence. The trail doesn't end in Montana. In Lovelock, Nevada, early miners reported discovering a cave filled with massive skeletons and strange artifacts. The most sensational finds reportedly went to museums, but when researchers visited years later, they were told those artifacts had been misplaced. In Catalina Island, California, an amateur archaeologist in the 1920s claimed to have found the remains of dozens of giant skeletons, only for his entire collection to disappear after his death, purchased by an unknown party. The thread weaving through these cases is the same. Discoveries that could rewrite history appear briefly, then vanish into obscurity. And when questions are asked, the answers are always vague, misfiled, misidentified, destroyed, inconclusive. For mainstream archaeology, this is simply a matter of separating fact from folklore, dismissing anything that doesn't meet strict evidentiary standards. But for those who've spent years chasing these leads, it looks like something far more deliberate. The obvious suspect, at least in the conspiracy circles, is the Smithsonian, not as a museum, but as an arm of a deeper agenda to preserve a specific version of human history. According to this theory, elongated skulls and giant skeletons pose a problem because they don't fit neatly into the current evolutionary narrative. If early North America hosted a population of giant, long-skulled people, It would force a rewrite of textbooks and challenge many comfortable assumptions about our past. Others suggest a more esoteric motive. Across cultures, elongated skulls have been linked to rulership, divine bloodlines, or even extraterrestrial origins. If there's any truth to those associations, then suppressing such remains isn't just about science. It's about controlling the narrative of who we are and where we come from. Of course, hard proof is scarce. Officially, there is nothing to find. The Montana skulls? Never documented. The Nevada cave giants? Just tall tales. The Catalina remains? Likely misidentified. But if you talk to locals, descendants, or those who were on site, the conviction in their voices is hard to ignore. In the Montana case, there is one tantalizing lead, a rumor that some of the crates didn't go to Washington, but to a private research facility in the Midwest. The story is unverifiable, but it has persisted for decades, passed quietly between amateur historians and researchers who suspect that private collectors, not just institutions, may be keeping these remains out of public view. If true, that opens a darker possibility that the erasure of such discoveries isn't only about protecting an academic narrative. It might also be about controlling access to something valuable, something beyond historical curiosity, artifacts, genetic material, clues to a technology or lineage we no longer understand. We may never know exactly what was taken from that Montana site. All we have are the scraps, a clipped newspaper column, a few second-hand recollections, and a repeating pattern seen in other lost digs. But those scraps tell a story of history being tidied up, cleaned of its inconvenient anomalies. The question is, why? Who benefits from keeping us in the dark about once walked these plains? And perhaps more chilling, what else has been buried, taken, or erased that we don't even know about? The Montana skulls are gone, but their absence may speak louder than their discovery ever could. Because sometimes what's missing from the record tells you more than what's left in it. In the shadowy margins of archived notes and whispered recollections, fragments of the Montana skulls still linger. Not the bones themselves. Those have vanished, but descriptions, sketches, and a handful of grainy photographs said to have been taken before the remains were spirited away. The images have never been verified, but their details are hauntingly consistent with eyewitness accounts. The skulls were not simply elongated, they were extreme. The cranium swept upward and back in a tapering arc, with a height nearly half again the length of the face. In profile, they resembled teardrops or inverted raindrops, the forehead sloping back at an angle no normal human anatomy could achieve without fracture. The orbits were deep, the jaw pronounced, and the sutures, those seams where skull bones fuse, seemed subtly different, almost as if they belonged to another blueprint altogether. Mainstream anthropology has a ready explanation. Cranial deformation, a practice known from the ancient Andes, the Maya, the Huns, and even certain tribes of North America. The method is straightforward. Bind the skulls of infants between boards or wrap them tightly in cloth, shaping the pliable bone over years into a desired form. It's cultural, symbolic, and well documented. But here's where the Montana skulls refuse to fit neatly into that category. According to those who examined them, before they disappeared, the skull capacity was significantly larger than an average human's, even before accounting for deformation. The bone thickness was uneven in strange ways, and the cranial vault expanded, not just upward, but outward, with a fullness that binding alone couldn't create. In short, these skulls weren't just shaped differently, they were built differently. One osteologist who saw photographs decades later noted something even more troubling: the foramen magnum, the hole at the base of the skull where the spine connects, appeared to be placed further back than in normal human anatomy. That single feature, if accurate, would indicate an entirely different posture or head alignment, a subtle clue that we might not be looking at Homo sapiens at all. Fringe researchers seized on these anomalies. Some argued these could represent a now extinct branch of humanity, perhaps a remnant of an ancient, tall, long-skulled race mentioned in indigenous legends. Others reached further, suggesting hybrid origins or even a lineage touched by something non-terrestrial. Still, the physical descriptions gnaw at the edges of plausibility. Imagine standing in that Montana dig trench, looking down at a skeleton taller than most men, with a skull so large and so alien in contour that it disrupts every assumption you've been taught about human form. The proportions would be unsettling, the kind of image that burns into memory and refuses to leave. Even among known elongated skull cultures, there is a limit to what binding can do. Anthropologists point out that when deformation is performed, the internal volume of the skull remains roughly the same as an unaltered human. You're reshaping the container, not enlarging it. Yet the Montana descriptions suggest not only shape but size, a cranial vault that could hold more brain mass than a typical human head. That's not cultural fashion. That's biology. If that's true, the implications are staggering. More cranial capacity could mean advanced cognition, or at least a different kind of cognition. Could these beings have thought differently, perceived reality in ways our species doesn't? It's speculation, yes, but speculation rooted in physical proportions that shouldn't exist, and yet reportedly did. A few surviving sketches, allegedly made by a dig assistant before the removal, show cross-sections of the skulls. The lines are careful, almost clinical, but the shapes defy comfort. The crown soaring high above the brow ridge, the base flaring wide before narrowing toward the jaw. If they are fakes made by someone with an unnerving grasp of human anatomy and how to break its rules convincingly. Then there's the question of origin. If these skulls belong to a separate human branch, where did they come from, and why so few? Could they be survivors of a much older wave of migration into North America, long before the peoples we now call Native Americans? This would align with certain oral histories that speak of the tall ones or the longheads, outsiders who arrived, ruled for a time, and then vanished. Of course, legends are slippery. They adapt, they embellish, and they blur the line between fact and myth. But it's curious how many cultures, across continents, remember beings with elongated heads, from the Nile to the Andes, from the Pacific Islands to the American Midwest. Are these independent inventions of human imagination or cultural memories of something real, preserved across millennia? The Montana skulls could have provided hard data to answer that. Bone isotopes could have revealed their diet and region of origin. DNA sequencing might have confirmed whether they were purely human or something else. But those opportunities were stolen with their disappearance. What we're left with is a tantalizing absence, an anatomy lesson we can't finish, a test that will never be run. And maybe that's the point. When you hold in your hands something that challenges the official story of humanity, not just a curiosity, but a piece of evidence that cracks the foundation, you have two choices: share it and watch the narrative change, or remove it quietly so the narrative never has to. In the Montana case, someone chose the latter. The sketches, the rumors, the inconsistent official responses, they're all that's left. But if those descriptions are even half true, then the Montana skulls weren't just archaeological oddities. They were biological impossibilities. And that, perhaps more than anything else, explains why they no longer exist in public view. Because impossible things have a way of vanishing, not because they aren't real, but because they are. Montana's elongated skulls might seem like an isolated oddity, a strange archaeological hiccup lost to bureaucratic silence. But the deeper you look, the harder it is to ignore that they fit into a pattern that stretches across continents and centuries. The Montana discovery wasn't an accident. It was a dot in a global constellation of anomalies. The most famous example lies half a world away in the arid deserts of southern Peru. The Paracas skulls, unearthed in the 1920s by Giulio Tello, shocked researchers with their extreme elongation, massive cranial capacity, and, in some cases, structural differences in bone thickness and suture lines, details eerily reminiscent of the Montana descriptions. DNA analysis on some of these skulls reportedly revealed markers not typically found in native populations of the Americas, hinting at an ancestry that remains unexplained. Official narratives acknowledge cranial deformation as a cultural practice in Paracas, but again, deformation changes shape, not size. Yet the Paracas skulls, like Montana's, seemed built differently. Travel north across the equator, and elongated crania appear again in the Maya world, where head binding was tied to status, beauty, and perhaps the mimicry of revered ancestors. Ancient art from Mesoamerica depicts nobles and deities with sloped foreheads and towering crowns, suggesting that elongated heads carried symbolic power. Whether those symbols were inspired purely by aesthetics or by memory of actual long-headed people remains an open question. Shift to Europe, and the puzzle deepens. In the limestone chambers of Malta's Hypogeum, a Neolithic underground temple complex, skulls with pronounced elongation were found alongside evidence of a sophisticated prehistoric society. The Hypogeum's acoustic properties suggest it was designed with advanced knowledge of sound resonance, knowledge we still struggle to fully replicate. Were these elongated-headed individuals architects, priests, or something else entirely? Their remains, like Montana's, have largely disappeared from public display. In Africa, similar finds appear in disparate regions. Excavations in the ancient Nubian kingdom revealed elongated skulls among certain elite burials, and in the Congo, anthropologists recorded accounts of tribes who claimed their ancestors were the tall ones with long heads, who came from the sky. While these accounts are often dismissed as mythology, the repetition of the imagery across cultures with no known contact is striking. Even in Asia, from the Eurasian steppes to remote valleys of Siberia, elongated skulls have been uncovered, often among warrior elites. The Huns, Scythians, and Sarmatians all practiced intentional deformation, but some skulls show proportions too extreme for binding alone. Archaeologists rarely linger on the possibility of genetic difference, preferring cultural explanations. But again, the pattern emerges: elongated skulls, high-status burials, advanced craftsmanship, and eventual disappearance. At first glance, these cases could be written off as cultural coincidences, different societies independently adopting a similar practice for symbolic or aesthetic reasons. After all, human cultures have often converged on similar ideas without direct contact. But there's another possibility. These practices were imitations. That somewhere, in deep prehistory, a real population with naturally elongated skulls existed, and their image was so powerful, so tied to leadership or divinity, that later cultures sought to copy it. The question is, who were they? Fringe researchers, unbound by the caution of academic consensus, suggest several theories. One posits that these long-headed people were a remnant of a lost, advanced civilization, a global maritime culture that spanned the world before the end of the last ice age, leaving behind fragments of their presence in scattered, unconnected lands. Others lean toward the extraterrestrial hypothesis, noting that many myths associate elongated-headed beings with sky gods or visitors from the heavens. Then there are the hybrid theories, the idea that these beings were the result of interbreeding between early humans and something else, producing distinct physical traits. Of course, mainstream archaeology sees no need to invoke lost civilizations or alien visitors. But here's the problem. In site after site, the most extreme examples vanish into museum vaults or private collections, quietly removed from public scrutiny. Malta's Hypogeum skulls? Gone. Several of the most unusual Paracas specimens? Missing. The Montana skulls? Disappeared before they could be studied in depth. Each case leaves behind only partial records, sketches, photographs, conflicting measurements, but never enough to reach a definitive conclusion. The pattern is hard to miss. A find that could reshape our understanding of human history is made, whispers of unusual anatomy circulate. Then the evidence is locked away, misplaced, or destroyed. We're told it's coincidence, curatorial backlog, or contamination concerns. Maybe it is. Or maybe history's strangest puzzle pieces are being quietly swept off the table before we can see the full picture. And yet, enough fragments remain to tempt the imagination. If Montana's skulls were connected to the same lineage as Paracas, Malta, or the Hypogeum, then we're looking at something far bigger than a local mystery. We're looking at a biological thread running through human history, one that official narratives either can't explain or won't. Because if elongated skulls appeared in isolated pockets all over the world, the odds of it being random cultural convergence shrink. It starts to look like inheritance, not of a fashion, but of a form. A form that carried power, influence, and maybe even abilities we've forgotten how to measure. The global parallels suggest that the Montana skulls weren't an isolated glitch in the archaeological record. They were part of a much older story, one that spans continents, crosses oceans, and reaches back into a time before recorded history. And perhaps a story that certain gatekeepers would rather we never piece together. If that's the case, then Montana wasn't just a dig site. It was a breach in the wall, one that for a moment let us glimpse something ancient, alien to our understanding, and far larger than any single discovery. And just like all the others, that breach was quickly sealed. Every conspiracy has two halves, the event itself and the cleanup. The Montana skulls were strange enough, but what happened after their discovery is where the story turns truly unsettling. It's a story we've heard before. A farmer digs up a massive femur in the late 1800s in Ohio, big enough to belong to a man over 8 feet tall. The local paper reports on it, the Smithsonian expresses interest, and within weeks, it's gone. No follow-up article, no photographs in public archives, no specimen on display. Over the decades, dozens of similar cases have trickled into the record. Newspaper clippings from the 19th and early 20th centuries describe skeletons measuring 7 to 12 feet in height, often with unusually shaped skulls, sometimes elongated, sometimes featuring odd sutures. They're found in burial mounds across the Midwest, in forgotten caves, along riverbanks. The pattern is always the same. The discovery makes local headlines, an institution steps in, and then silence. The Smithsonian, often the final stop for these remains, has repeatedly denied that such specimens exist in their collections. And yet, former employees and independent researchers claim otherwise. In 2014, a story went viral alleging that the Smithsonian had destroyed thousands of giant skeletons in the early 1900s to protect the accepted narrative of human evolution. The institution called the story a hoax, but the rumor refused to die because it fits too well with what many have observed: a century of vanishing evidence. Freedom of Information Act requests have unearthed peculiar gaps in Smithsonian records from the period when many of these skeletons were allegedly collected. Catalog numbers are missing. Shipping manifests mention unusual specimens with no final destination noted. In some cases, surviving field notes describe remains that never appear in official inventories. The paper trail doesn't end in a clear answer. It ends in an absence, and absence is a shape of its own. Whistleblowers add more fuel. Retired archaeologists have spoken, off the record, about sensitive finds being redirected to storage facilities inaccessible to the public. Some describe internal instructions to avoid certain terminology in reports: giant, anomalous, non-human, and instead use neutral, non-specific language. One even claimed that anomalous skulls were sometimes lent to labs for study and never returned, with no explanation given. It's tempting to see this as mere bureaucratic incompetence, Museums misplace artifacts, funding runs dry, and curators move on. But the scale of the erasure, and its consistency over time, suggests something more coordinated. And here's where it gets darker. If these remains truly represented a different branch of humanity, or even a hybrid species, acknowledging them would demand rewriting enormous portions of history. Textbooks would change. Origin theories would shift. Academic careers built on the current narrative could crumble. For the institutions tasked with guarding our past, the safest path might be to simply not open that door. But there's another angle, whispered by those who've chased this story for years, that these beings, whether giant or long-headed, weren't just a thing of the distant past, that they might have persisted far longer than officially acknowledged. Some Native American oral traditions speak of wars against a race of tall ones who lived in fortified mounds or deep caves. If even a fragment of those stories held true, it could mean the last of these beings walked the earth far more recently than archaeology admits. Imagine what it would mean if the Montana skulls, and their global counterparts, hinted at a lineage that didn't die out tens of thousands of years ago, but coexisted with our ancestors into historical times. That would make the question of their disappearance not just academic, but political. If there was indeed a systematic effort to hide them, the reasons could extend beyond protecting science's reputation. It could be about preventing the public from realizing just how incomplete and possibly manipulated our understanding of human history really is. It could be about keeping certain truths in the hands of a few, truths that, if widely known, might alter humanity's perception of itself overnight. And so the machinery of suppression rolls on, not in dramatic Hollywood-style raids, but in quiet memos, in selective funding, in museum policies written in language only insiders can decipher. It's not about proving the Montana skulls are part of a lost race. It's about making sure you never have enough evidence to prove anything at all. The Montana case, like those in Ohio, Malta, or Peru, follows the same playbook. Discovery, short burst of public attention, official intervention, disappearance, then decades of unanswered questions. Perhaps the most chilling part is that this isn't a relic of the past. Even in the digital age, finds vanish. In 2007, a private researcher photographed an unusually large skull in a small town museum's back room. By the time he returned to request further study, the artifact was gone, transferred, according to staff, though they couldn't say where. The photographs he took? Corrupted when his hard drive inexplicably failed. Coincidence? Bad luck? Or just another piece swallowed by the machine? If you step back, you see a historical record that looks less like a smooth, continuous line and more like Swiss cheese full of holes, with someone making sure the holes never get filled. The official narrative of our past might be more curated than complete. And if that's true, then the Montana skulls aren't just an archaeological curiosity. They're evidence, not only of a mystery buried in the earth, but of the forces working to keep it buried. Which begs the question, what kind of truth is so dangerous, so destabilizing, that it's worth erasing from the record entirely? And who gets to decide what humanity is allowed to remember? When it comes to elongated skulls, from the windswept cliffs of Paracas to the quiet plains of Montana, the greatest battles aren't fought in the dirt, but in conference rooms, peer-reviewed journals, and late-night debates between people who see the same facts but arrive at opposite realities. Mainstream archaeology has a straightforward explanation: head-binding. Cultures across the world, from the Mayans to the Mangbatu of Africa, practiced cranial deformation for centuries. Infant skulls, still soft and malleable, were bound with cloth or wooden boards to create an elongated shape, often as a marker of beauty, status, or identity. This, they argue, explains every skull, the Montana specimens included. It's a tidy narrative, backed by anthropology textbooks, museum exhibits, and countless documented examples. But independent researchers and fringe historians point to anomalies that don't fit so neatly. In some skulls, the volume of the cranial cavity is significantly larger than that of a normal human. Others have missing sagittal sutures, the seam that runs along the top of the skull, or unusual bone thickness. Skeptics of the head-binding theory argue that these features aren't the product of cultural modification at all, but of biology. That's where the tension ignites. Scientists say these anomalies can be explained by natural variation, pathology, or even poor measurement techniques. Researchers outside the establishment counter that those explanations feel like reflexive dismissals, answers designed to preserve the existing framework, not question it. The Montana skulls, according to official statements, show nothing extraordinary beyond expected deformation patterns. Yet curiously, no detailed morphological report has been made widely available. Requests for high-resolution scans, DNA sequencing data, and isotopic analysis have been met with delays or outright refusals. To the mainstream, this is standard protocol. Certain tests require funding, permissions, and ethical oversight. To the conspiracy-minded, it's a familiar stall tactic, one they've seen play out before. And so, two realities form side by side. In one, science is methodical, cautious, unwilling to jump to extraordinary conclusions without extraordinary evidence. In the other, science is a gatekeeper, guarding its castle walls against disruptive truths. The public is caught in the crossfire. Documentaries, YouTube channels, and fringe publications present compelling visual comparisons, overlaying skulls from Peru, Malta, and Montana, pointing out shared proportions that shouldn't exist if each was shaped by a different culture's binding practices. Meanwhile, academic papers quietly reinforce the head-binding consensus, rarely acknowledging the outliers, except to fold them into the existing model. The fight isn't just about bone, it's about credibility. Once a researcher crosses into territory labeled pseudoscience, their funding dries up, their publications are ignored, and their professional reputation suffers irreparable damage. This is why some insiders say the real censorship isn't about physically hiding artifacts, but about burying them under layers of ridicule and professional risk. Yet, the skeptics have their own blind spots. Some independent investigators cherry-pick data, relying on dramatic claims without proper peer review. Misidentified skulls, exaggerated measurements, and misinterpreted X-rays have all muddied the waters. For every credible anomaly, there's a shaky photograph taken in poor lighting, or a third-hand story passed down without documentation. These gaps make it easy for the mainstream to dismiss the entire field as a playground for the gullible. Still, there's a strange irony here. Both sides accuse the other of narrative control. Mainstream archaeology accuses fringe researchers of misleading the public with sensationalism. Fringe researchers accuse mainstream archaeology of misleading the public through omission. And somewhere in between lies the tantalizing possibility that both are missing pieces of the truth or hiding them. The Montana discovery has become a flashpoint for this wider battle. To one side, it's simply another example of a known cultural practice, folded neatly into the vast tapestry of human diversity. To the other, it's a rare North American data point in a global pattern that points to a forgotten chapter in human history, one that stretches from the high deserts of South America to the icy shores of the Great Lakes. The problem is that neither side can conclusively prove their case without unrestricted access to the evidence. And access, as we've seen, is precisely what seems to vanish. Whether it's a museum's storage vaults or a university's research freezer, the bones rest in silence, while the arguments rage on above them. This battle isn't just about the past, it's about who gets to own the story of the past. In the age of information, the truth is no longer a single, unchallenged line in a textbook. It's a contested space, fought over by credentialed experts, passionate amateurs, and shadowy institutions that prefer to operate without an audience. And in that contested space, elongated skulls, whether human, hybrid, or something stranger, have become a litmus test for the limits of what we're allowed to consider possible. The Montana case forces the question: is the gap between science and myths shrinking, or are we just getting better at dressing myths in the language of science? Imagine waking up tomorrow to a headline that breaks the world in half. Montana dig reveals non-human skeletons, Smithsonian confirms. The photographs are undeniable. The elongated skulls are displayed under glass, high-resolution scans released online for anyone to examine. DNA sequencing is complete, peer-reviewed, and the results are unlike anything in the human genome. No whispers. No pending research. No hidden vaults. The truth is out. The first shockwave wouldn't come from the scientists. It would come from the people. Indigenous elders across North America might step forward with stories their communities have guarded for generations. Tales of tall, strange-headed people who roamed the land before their ancestors arrived. What was once dismissed as myth would suddenly be seen in a new light, its metaphors revealed as veiled memories of encounters long forgotten by the mainstream. Religions would face their own moment of reckoning. Texts that spoke of giants, Nephilim, or the sons of gods would be reread with a fresh urgency. For some, the discovery would be a vindication, proof that Scripture was telling a literal history all along. For others, it would be destabilizing, a crack in the foundation that once felt immovable. Anthropology would be thrown into chaos. The careful, linear story of human evolution, the tidy march from Australopithecus to Homo sapiens, would be shattered. A parallel branch of intelligent life on Earth would force textbooks to be rewritten and long-settled debates to be reopened. Every museum would scramble to reclassify artifacts. Every school curriculum would have to be rewritten. Governments would respond with a mix of control and reassurance. Press conferences would be held, urging calm, framing the discovery as a fascinating but non-threatening chapter of our past. But behind the scenes, intelligence agencies would quietly assess whether these beings might still exist, hidden away in remote places. Academia would fracture. Some scholars would embrace the find with exhilaration, seeing it as a once-in-a-lifetime chance to expand our understanding. Others would dig in, insisting the interpretation was flawed, that this was all a misclassification, an overreach. The same debates that kept the skulls in the shadows for decades would now rage in full public view, but louder, sharper, and impossible to ignore. The media machine would feed on the frenzy. Documentaries, exposes, debates, talk shows. For months, nothing else would dominate the news cycle. Ancient aliens enthusiasts, alternative historians, theologians, geneticists, all speaking over each other, each trying to claim the narrative. The stock market? Unpredictable. Defense budgets? Likely to increase. Space agencies? Suddenly flush with funding, spurred on by the tantalizing possibility that our mysterious others might have connections beyond Earth. But there's a quieter, more personal effect that would ripple out, the way it would change how each of us sees ourselves. To know that we were not the only intelligent species to walk these lands, that we shared this planet with others who thought, built, dreamed, perhaps even loved as we do. It would shift our sense of uniqueness. Some would find it humbling, others terrifying. For a few, it might even feel like a reunion, a long-lost chapter of our family history restored. Yet, there's a shadow to this vision, because if the truth emerged, the full truth, then every deliberate suppression, every missing artifact, every whistleblower's silenced testimony would also come to light. Institutions we trusted might be revealed as manipulators of history. The narrative of protecting the public from panic would clash with the outrage of being denied our shared past. And here's the uncomfortable reality. Such a revelation would not unite us overnight. It would polarize. The discovery would become politicized, weaponized in culture wars. drawn into the endless tug-of-war between belief and skepticism. For every person it inspired, it might frighten another. But over time, something else might happen. A century from that moment, classrooms could teach a broader, richer origin story, one where the Montana skulls are just a single point on a vast, interconnected map of human and near-human species, where history is not a straight line, but a branching, tangled forest, where the mythic and the scientific meet, not as enemies, but as puzzle pieces finally clicking into place. It's a tempting vision, but one we may never see, because for now, the truth, if it exists, remains locked away. And the Montana skulls? They still sit in their quiet, climate-controlled darkness, their story untold, waiting. And maybe that's the most haunting part. Not that the truth isn't out there, but that it might be, and someone has already decided we're not ready to know it. The storm of what if still hangs in the air. We've imagined the chaos, the rewriting of history, the deep fractures and unexpected revelations that would follow if the Montana skulls were truly publicly unveiled. But here's the truth. That day has not come, and the plains where it all began are still silent. The wind sweeps low across the grasslands, the same wind that once carried the dust of 14 graves into the sky when shovels first broke the soil. The land looks empty, almost ordinary, as if nothing of significance had ever happened here. But that's the thing about places like this. They keep their secrets well. Official reports claim the site has been fully excavated and that nothing remains to be found. Yet some of the original dig team, those who dared to speak off the record, insist the soil still hides more. They talk about markers in the earth, anomalies on ground-penetrating radar, and sections of the burial ground that were deliberately left untouched before the site was sealed. Why seal it at all, if there was nothing left? Archaeologists will tell you it's standard preservation. Those sites are often closed to protect them from looters, erosion, or amateur digs. But those who believe the Montana skulls were something extraordinary see a different motive, the quiet burial of history itself. A way to ensure the deeper layers remain unexamined, their contents undisturbed and unreported. It's not just the physical site that's been locked away. The paper trail, too, has gaps you could drive a truck through. Missing catalog numbers, lab results that were misfiled, photographs that surfaced briefly in obscure archives, only to vanish when researchers went looking again. The few remaining artifacts that are publicly accessible have been stripped of their context, labeled vaguely, displayed without reference to where or with whom they were found. The skeletons themselves? Gone. Some say they were transferred to larger institutions for study. Others believe they've disappeared entirely into private collections or restricted storage, never to be seen again. And so the burial ground waits. Beneath its layer of grass and silence, perhaps there are still bones, elongated skulls untouched by human hands for centuries. Perhaps there are objects buried with them, artifacts that could tell us who these people were, what they believed, how they lived, and why they vanished. Or perhaps the real answers lie even deeper. What if this site was just one fragment of a much larger story, a network of burial grounds stretching across the continent? A map of a civilization we've never acknowledged? The Montana discovery could be a single puzzle piece, and without the others, we'll never see the full picture. But maybe that's the point. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. The past isn't always uncovered accidentally. Sometimes it's stumbled upon at the wrong time, by the wrong people, and in the wrong political climate. And when that happens, the past has a way of being buried again, deeper than before. Think of the silence not as absence, but as control. As if the site itself is frozen, not by nature, but by decision. A decision made somewhere far above the level of the original dig crew. We don't know what lies beneath the rest of this ground. We don't know if the truth is still there, waiting, or if it's already been quietly removed under cover of darkness. What we do know is that the mystery has never been resolved. The grass still bends in the wind, the earth still keeps its mouth shut, and somewhere, someone knows exactly why. Maybe that's the final twist, that the answers to Montana's elongated skulls don't rest only in the soil. They rest in locked rooms, in classified files, in whispered warnings between colleagues. The site may be quiet, but the questions it raises are not. And until the day the Earth is allowed to give up its full story, we're left standing here at the edge of the plains, staring into a horizon that feels like it's holding something back. What still lies beneath? We may never know. Or maybe we already do. If you enjoyed today's video, kindly like this and subscribe to our channel. That means a lot to us.